you go ahead and start setting up your screen share too, and then I'll turn my camera off because nobody wants to look at my face, trust me.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome.
So my name's Shadow Smith. It is my real name. What I'm going to be talking about today is CSS On-Demand with Tailwind's new JIT compiler. So if you've never used Tailwind before, it's totally okay. I've actually designed the beginning of this talk to kind of introduce you to Tailwind as a concept. And then the end of the talk is talking about the Tailwind JIT compiler. And then, of course, there's a repo set up where I do a live demo of how to use it and what cool new features that it adds to just working with Tailwind in general and your workflow as a developer. So I'm going to pause real quick. Of course, not the live stream, but just my talking. And I'm going to set up my screen share. So I'll be right with you. Cool. So you should be able to see my slides. It says CSS On-Demand, Introduction to Tailwind and its new just-in-time compiler. And Will, when you get a chance, can you tell me when to kick this thing off?
Yeah, you're good to go. Let's go ahead and get started. It's right at 6. Thanks everybody for joining. Like I said before, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. I'll try to ask when Shadow takes a breath. And we can also wrap up at the end with a Q&A if anybody has anything that wasn't covered. So thank you so much, Shadow. We really appreciate you talking tonight, and this topic's going to be really fun. So take it away.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So as I've said 3-4 times now, this talk is CSS On-Demand, an introduction to Tailwind and its new JIT compiler. And I am Shadow Smith. I'm a senior software engineer at Openly, a new insurtech startup that's based out of Boston with a distributed workforce. And just to kind of pop this in, we're hiring Go engineers and Vue engineers. So you can head on over to our website, openly.com, click on careers, go through all that stuff, and maybe join my team. So that'd be really cool. All right. So like I said earlier, the beginning of this talk is going to be based around kind of introducing new people to the concept of Tailwind. I know that some people know, Bootstrap or Materialize CSS or other CSS frameworks, but they haven't really used Tailwind before because, if you're coming from a beginner level side of web development, you may not understand how JavaScript can be used for CSS. And Tailwind does have a little bit of a JavaScript component, which I will talk through here in detail. So what is Tailwind? So Tailwind is a tool used to convert a customizable design system into a low-level utility-first CSS framework. So Tailwind is considered a low-level utility-first CSS framework. And in order to really understand what that means, I kind of need to explain the opposite of that. So a high-level component-first way to make a button with a CSS framework like Bootstrap would be, like you see here on screen, you add a class of BTN that has a ton of opinionated CSS styling to it. And then you add a BTN primary class to change the color. And then you get the little button that you see on screen here. And again, this example is for Bootstrap, which, if you haven't used it, you've definitely seen this button before on the internet somewhere. Well, Tailwind doesn't want to be that high level because it wants to, the creators actually don't want to enforce a ton of opinions on the actual look of your components, like your actual pieces of your application or website. So the low level utility first way to make a button, which this is the Tailwind way, is you would have a class that actually describes what color the button should be. So this would be in Tailwind, BG blue 500. And then you also would describe what color you want the text to be, which could be text white. And then there are utility classes for padding. So you have PY for your top and bottom, which is set to 2, and PX, which is your left and right, set to 4. And then if you want to make the corners of the button rounded, you would apply the rounded CSS class to it. So as you can see, it is low. This is completely different than the high level approach where it's just BTN. The only way to really overwrite, the border radius of a bootstrap button is to do some hard coded, bang symbol important CSS styles that makes your CSS very difficult to maintain over the long run. Whereas this low level utility first approach that Tailwind introduces gives you the ability to essentially shortcut to CSS properties instead of a whole CSS class. Cool. So back to what is Tailwind. I'm highlighting here that it is a way to convert a customizable design system. So this is another concept that is core to what Tailwind is. So, if we go back to kind of comparing it to Bootstrap as a framework, you don't have a say over the Bootstrap framework. You don't have a say over how, your spacing or your font colors or the background colors or responsive utilities or any of these things. You kind of have to deal with what the framework gives you. Of course, you can expand it, and with all these preprocessors, you can customize the way the framework works to some extent. But Tailwind really lets you define the atoms of what you want this low-level utility CSS framework to be. And the way you actually define this customizable design system is once you have Tailwind in your project, you can run npx tailwind css init, and it will give you a tailwind.config.js file. And Tailwind themselves, they've added a bunch of sensible defaults. There's some colors, there's default spacing that the creators of Tailwind spent countless hours tweaking and ensuring that those defaults, you kind of can run an entire project without changing them at all. And I don't really know a lot of people who completely overwrite Tailwind's defaults. They typically just add additional things that are specific to their project. So like a specific breakpoint or something of that nature. But if you wanted to, you could completely overwrite everything that Tailwind gives you out of the box. And you would do that with this tailwind.config.js file as well. So with this file, you are able to define what colors you want your Tailwind to essentially create a CSS framework with, what spacing you would like to be in that framework. And that spacing can be for margin, padding, all of those utilities. It's actually, there's a ton. So if you're curious to learn more about all the different configurations that you can make, totally head over to tailwindcss.com after the talk and just browse through their documentation. So like I was saying, this tailwind.config.js file is where you set your design system settings, if you want to think of it that way. So as you can see in this screenshot, I'm adding gray, blue, red, and pink. It's just these colors that come from the Tailwind CSS colors package. But this could be literally anything. This could be, single quote, hex code, or RGBA, or whatever right here. And then when Tailwind generates this CSS framework for you, it will use those colors across all utility CSS classes that those colors need to be added to. So for instance, for this gray, this blue, this red, and this pink, Tailwind is going to create background utilities for those colors, text color utilities for those colors, and a bunch of other stuff that I can't recall off the top of my head. So, and as you can see here, it even goes deeper than that. Like part of your design system, of course, is font family, because a large part of a brand's identity is which fonts they pick. So in this one, you can see that I have the graphic font selected to be first, and then, you know, if for whatever reason that's not available, it will use sans serif behind that. And for serif, it's Merriweather and serif. And then down here is where I'm actually extending the spacing scale of Tailwind. So like I said, Tailwind has a ton of defaults, but it doesn't go up to 128 or 32 rem or 144 with 36 rem. So that's being added to this object here. And then whenever Tailwind, again, builds this entire CSS framework for you, it will add those spacing utilities to all of the padding, all of the margin, and any other CSS properties that would rely on that. Cool. So now that we kind of covered that, what is Tailwind's JIT compiler? So Tailwind's JIT compiler generates the styles on demand as you use Tailwind CSS classes in your template. So to give you a little information as to why this is a big deal, in development, Tailwind can create some absolutely massive CSS files. Like I said, whenever you go in and you describe all of the atoms your design system needs that you wish to be in this CSS framework that Tailwind creates for you, if you, depending on which customizations to your design system, or whether you add like new breakpoints or new like variants and all of these different concepts to your tailwind.config.js file, this thing can get massive. It can get up to 12 megabytes and more. And once it gets to that size in development, it is a big problem because build tools start to break down. You know, browser dev tools start to really struggle loading a CSS file that big. But you know, for those of us who have used Tailwind in the past, we know that this isn't a problem in production, because whenever Tailwind is used to deploy your CSS to a production environment, it uses a thing called Purge Css under the hood, which will purge all of these CSS classes that you don't actually use in your project. But in development, it doesn't know to do that yet. But Tailwind's JIT compiler is the solution for that. And I will, you know, at the end of the talk, there's going to be a demo where I show all of this stuff. Yeah, so totally seems like I'm skipping ahead of my own slides. So I'm going to slow down and follow along here. So why is JIT needed? Like I said, Tailwind can easily make massive CSS files that slow down local development, preventing developers from using all of Tailwind's features. And why is Tailwind's JIT compiler so awesome? Well, in development and production, it will always generate the smallest CSS file possible. It dramatically speeds up Tailwind builds locally. Like I said before, whenever these Tailwind CSS files, or whenever the actual description in the tailwind.config.js file gets to be decently large and Tailwind has to do a lot of work, it can take a couple seconds for Tailwind to actually generate all of the CSS utilities required for your project based on your configurations. But with Tailwind's JIT compiler, it actually looks at what you're using in your template and only generates the CSS for the Tailwind classes that you use. So it can dramatically cut it down to milliseconds from 6, 7, 8, 9 seconds of build time. Another awesome feature of Tailwind's JIT compiler is it unlocks new features and possibilities. So Tailwind's JIT compiler is relatively new. Actually, it's very, very new. It has only really been talked about for a couple of weeks, and it's still in kind of a preview phase, but it is going to be the foundation of Tailwind 3 per the creator of Tailwind. But in its short lifespan so far, there's been 3 or 4 new, very helpful features that Tailwind's JIT compiler gives us access to, and there's just more coming. The Tailwind creators just have to think of how to utilize this. So that's very exciting. Another thing too is it eliminates complicated variant configuration. This is a decently complicated topic that I won't dive too deep into the weeds on in this talk, but I will demo some of this later on. But long story short, whenever you have to, whenever you add things to your tailwind.config.js file for your design system, Tailwind out of the box can't support every pseudo selector like hover, active, disabled, those types of states out of the box without Tailwind's JIT compiler, because in development, those variants bloat the CSS file astronomically. It actually makes the CSS file very, very big just by having all variants on at once. Well, with Tailwind's JIT compiler, you have the ability to use all of these variants without having to do that complicated configuration. And again, as you use those variants, Tailwind will just create the CSS for it on the fly. So it's very exciting. All right, so let me show you everything about Tailwind's JIT compiler. So right here at the top is a link to a Tailwind JIT demo repo on GitHub. I'll leave it up here for a second if you guys want to navigate to it. And then the second link there is an article that I wrote for, it's essentially what I'm giving a talk on right now, but it goes into a little bit more structured thought on things. Has a link to additional Tailwind resources and that repo that's linked right above it. So totally check that out. And I'm going to be using that repo as the basis for the demo. So feel free to fork it, go nuts with it, figure out how it all works, and yeah, get excited. Sweet. So, all right. Cool. So I am in VS Code, and I'm inside of that Tailwind JIT demo repo. And the first thing I'm going to show you is the tailwind.config.js file, because I talked a lot about this through the slides, and I really want you to get your eyes on what this looks like if you've never used Tailwind before. So my mouse just died. That's crazy. All right. Okay. All right. So as you can see here, this is the tailwind.config.js file that I have set up for this project. All of these customizations that I have here are very expensive customizations. And when Tailwind generates the CSS framework for me, which is essentially just creating my styles.css file, it's going to be absolutely massive. And I just want to show you what I mean by that. So if I go down here and I run npm run build, which is in the package.json, it's a typical build command. It's based on Tailwind and post CSS, and it really just takes in my Tailwind configuration, tailwind.css file with the utilities, all this stuff, all this like pre-setup stuff. If you want to dig into more how to do that, Tailwind's website does a very, very good job explaining that. But anyway, I'm gonna run npm run build, and you'll see it's processing, and it took 6.8 seconds to build a 12 megabyte CSS file just based on these configurations. Don't get me wrong, it is these variants, and it is dark mode and this additional breakpoint that's added that is ballooning this file size, because all of those customizations have to be applied to many, many utility classes that Tailwind generates for us. This isn't going to be the case for all projects, but if you ever run into this problem, Tailwind JIT will be a beautiful solution for you. So now if I click on the styles.css file that this command generated, you can see that this thing is so long that VS Code is like freaking out about how to even tokenize this as CSS. As you can see, if I scroll down, you can see that there's all of these variants that Tailwind created that has all of these different colors like black. And if I scroll down even more, you'll see, yeah, it's just, there's a lot here. There's just a ton. And in development, without Tailwind's JIT compiler, this is what you would actually have to use through your development process. But I think this is like 500,000 lines or something. It's absolutely insane. And this has always been a hard constraint with Tailwind, is how to, so we're at 504,049 lines of CSS off of just these customizations. Just nuts. Like I was saying though, this has always been a hard constraint of Tailwind. Tailwind is capable of so much useful things, but you can't ever really use it to its fullest extent, because in development, it will balloon your CSS to such a large size that it's just hard to work with in general. To further illustrate how difficult it is, I'm going to open up these guys. I'm going to run npm run serve to just serve this little index.html file that I have here. And if I use my inspector tools, see how long it's taking that to load? I'm going to refresh this so you can see that again. See how it's like, it takes quite a, for us developers, if it's not instant, it's long. So it takes quite a while. And if I toggle things on and off, you see how long it takes for that to be reflected? It's insane. So that is what happens whenever you use a lot of Tailwind CSS customizations, and it creates that massive file. So that's the pain of that process. So let's go through the motions of changing this. All right. So if I go here, and what I'm going to do now is toggle on the JIT compiler. And luckily with Tailwind, whenever I was originally prepping this talk, the just-in-time compiler wasn't a part of Tailwind, the actual Tailwind core. It was a third-party package that you pulled in. But not long ago, there was a new release, I think it was 2.1, Tailwind 2.1, that added the just-in-time compiler as a mode right here. So all I have to do is uncomment the just-in-time compiler mode, save it, and then I'm going to run my npm run build again. And that was so fast, I don't even know if you really saw what happened. I just compiled the CSS needed for that little page that I just showed you, and it took 6 681 milliseconds to do that. It was so fast and the file size is so small that my output isn't even telling me how big the file is. So now if I look at the styles.css file, we don't have 500,000 lines here. We have 54. And every single one of these can be traced back to what my index.html file is using. So as you can see, I'm using this utility, I'm using these utility classes on the body, this utility class on the child below that, and so on. And these are utility classes that I know will be there based on my configuration. But Tailwind only makes this stuff when I use it. So I don't have to worry about my Chrome developer tools being super slow. I don't have to worry about waiting on this build or anything like that. I will give you a heads up, the actual tooling in this repo won't automatically rebuild Tailwind when there are changes, but that's a relatively simple thing that you could add to your project. And if you're using a framework like Nuxt for Vue or Next for React or something like that, they have additional libraries that handle all of that live reloading stuff for you. So what I want to do is I want to actually pull this over. This is not fun on just a laptop. Cool. I'm going to pull that over and I'm going to open up my index.html file. And I just want to like show you how cool this is to see this happen. So as you can see, there's this HScreen CSS class here that Tailwind created for us. If I completely take this out of my markup and then I rerun my build command, it's gone. So it's not even in there at all. And it won't be there in production either. That's one of the cool things about Tailwind's JIT compiler is everything that you see in development is everything that you'll see in production. So there's no fear of accidentally purging something that you really needed and getting some undesirable styling issues because of it in production. Cool. So really, what I would like to do now is kind of showcase some of the functionalities that Tailwind's JIT compiler adds to Tailwind that you don't get if you don't use it. Yeah, if you just use Tailwind without JIT mode on, these functionalities won't work. But with it on, you actually get access to these really cool things. So one of the first things that I'm going to show off is Tailwind's new arbitrary class support. So kind of fuzzy to say that, but it'll make sense as I actually do it in practice and show you. So as you can see, well, let me add this guy back real quick, save that. Oops. Rerun this command. Cool. So as you can see, I have this dark blue background, and that's actually defined as part of my Tailwind config. It's this dark blue right here. But let's say I have some weird one-off case where I need it to be a pink background. It doesn't match my design system, and that's okay, because this is one of those cases where I have to match a UI or a button or something to one of my co-branded partners. So I have to like make my website have their colors, but it's not part of my design system. Before, without Tailwind's JIT compiler, you'd actually have to define their colors as part of your design system, and that's kind of weird. So with this new arbitrary class feature, we don't have to do that, and I will show you what I'm talking about. So Tailwind Tailwind's JIT compiler introduces this new syntax where you just have brackets, and then you can throw in whatever you want here. Well, not whatever, but it for like a background color utility or a text color utility, it needs to be some type of hex code, or it even takes like the actual proper CSS names for colors and things like that, and it will automatically create the CSS for that, even if it's not defined in your Tailwind config. It feels kind of magical, really. So I can literally say BG pink, go down here, rerun my build. And if you see this, that Tailwind just made, it is literally this BG pink class. And it adds the RGBA value for the CSS pink with an opacity of 1. And if I go over here, it's actually really hard to look at because it's so bright, but it made it pink, and it's not part of my CSS design system as code in my Tailwind config at all. So that's a pretty exciting thing. So we can change that back. And then another really cool feature that it adds is the ability to use variants without having to do all of that configuration. So one variant that I could add here that I haven't had to configure, and honestly, this variant may come out of the box with Tailwind, but this is just a demonstration. You can use focus with no configuration. And is it over here? Yeah, there it is. Oh yeah, no, I'm dumb. Yeah, so I just added the focus variant to the text Twitter blue color. So it took away the actual text Twitter blue color, and now it only applies it if the link is in focus, which you will see here. If I click and like hold it, there it is. So we can change that back. And I can't even stress how big of a deal it is that you don't have to configure these variants any longer. There was a lot of complexity around that, and it was one of the more difficult parts of Tailwind because of the way that it handles if you have multiple variants on a single type in your Tailwind config. The way it actually creates these, you actually do kind of fight the CSS like cascading effect, and some of the variants can override others and things like that. And you have to be like aware of that. And in all honesty, that part of that limitation applies to the way that you apply these to the CSS class, but you don't have to think about it unless you have to think about it. I don't know. Anyway, so really that's the end of my demo. There are a few other features that Tailwind's JIT compiler introduces, but all you have to do is just go to their website and kind of take a look through there, and they're very, very simple and very, very straightforward. Like for instance, you can use a bang operator now in front of a Tailwind class, and once you build it, it will actually add important. One of the reasons why I don't want to kind of talk about that today too much is I feel that's somewhat of an anti-pattern, but that's my opinion. It's very helpful whenever you're in a situation where you don't control all the CSS of your project and you really want Tailwind to win. That's a way to do it. And you have to use Tailwind's JIT compiler to achieve that. So yeah, that's all I really have for my talk. Totally open to hopping over to the YouTube chat and seeing what questions anyone has.
Hey, we don't have any questions yet, Shadow, but I think
Oh,
one thing
cool.
that might be cool to show is, before this type of variant override, right? Like specifically for like your pink background, or maybe changing a font size that are a little bit out of your design system.
Yeah, yeah,
One thing would be like either to create, your own CSS class that you could apply, right? Or an inline style. But having it this way, where you can actually just drop it in line and use the syntax that Tailwind offers you, allows you to keep those conventions, and then
yeah,
also change it. Allows the purging of those CSS properties if they're no longer in use, right? So it's
sure.
a little bit cleaner that way. Um, maybe could you demonstrate? I don't know, maybe it's like some um, font face or font size changes, or even
Yeah,
maybe more like a complex like pseudo selector, like something. I don't know, I'm making something up, like uh, background colored when it's focused, and then change the padding when it's focused or hovered or something. Like you can now with the JIT you can string all those things together, where before
yeah, that's
with
true.
the config file you would have had to create those variants, and again the ballooning would have happened, right? But
Yeah,
now you
for
can just
sure.
kind of on the fly. And also, kind of while you're thinking through that, Jason asked, "Does the JIT support hot reload?"
Um, yeah, if you go to the Tailwind CSS website, they actually do have a command that I didn't add into this demo, where it will watch for changes to your template, and it will automatically generate the CSS.
Yeah, and if you're using something like React or Vue or whatever, typically you do something like post CSS within your Webpack config or whatever
Yeah,
to actually like invoke the Tailwind engine. And since if you have JIT enabled, the normal hot reloading mechanism would still work, but the JIT compiler would just deliver a much smaller CSS bundle to that hot reload as an update. So it should
yep,
support it. Um,
yeah, absolutely. Cool. So yeah, I'm down to just go crazy with this thing, honestly. If you guys want to do that, I will. Yeah, let's keep the background blue, but let's do kind of what you said, Will. And like if the background is hovered, let's change the color of it. So we can do BG, and let's actually use this new syntax to throw something in that's not uh, part of the design system. And
I'll say one thing that was particularly of a pain in the ass was like absolute position things. Like they have helpful inset and top positions using rims and things like that. But sometimes you just
yeah,
want to
yeah,
like, I needed exactly 6 pixels top and 3 pixels left, and having to do that, adding a variant in there again would balloon your stuff up, or you'd have to do like
yeah,
an
for sure.
inline or a custom class declaration. Now you can just do top bracket, 10 or 7 pixels, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it may be worth like just hopping over to kind of some of their examples in the documentation and kind of talk through those there and apply them back over to what we're looking at.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. And y'all feel free to add any questions in the chat if
Yeah,
you have any.
yeah. So as you can see, tailwindcss.com is the where the documentation lives. And right here under customization, there's the just-in-time mode. And there's the announcement of this new awesome feature. And let's see here. Yeah, and as that one gentleman asked, actually doing a watch mode, this is where you can find that setup. So you can do like in development, run this with the W flag, and it will do an actual watch process. Use arbitrary value. Yeah, so this is pretty much exactly what you're talking about, Will. You have the bracket syntax with uh, just some arbitrary number for a thing that there was no, whenever you created your design system, you had no way of knowing that you're going to need 918 pixel height. But here it is, like you have to do it. You can actually handle this with this new arbitrary value support. So yeah, let's get into that. So one thing that we could do, I'm just gonna kind of kill all this stuff. Give ourselves a div, and we're gonna add class. Let's make it.
Hey, Shadow, it looks like we need to restart the screen share.
Oh, my bad. I totally did take that off. Yep, no worries. Give me a second.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you. Sweet. So I took away the guts of the little splash page demo that I had here. And I'm just going to add like a little div, and we can play with it with these arbitrary values. So let's give it an actual background color. So let's call it BG. Let's do some bracket stuff, arbitrary value stuff, and let's make it red. And let's make the height. Yeah, so I have there's a Tailwind extension that gives you this like IntelliSense type experience based on your Tailwind config. And just for now, I'm going to make this H4 and width 4, maybe too small, but let's see. Let me rerun the build. Cool, and you can see that a lot of my CSS kind of got stripped completely out because it's not being used anymore, which is a really cool feature. I'm doing it this way. I can never remember hex codes. Maybe way too small.
Might need a rebuild.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, I should have set that up for this demo. I'm spoiled by it. Okay, cool. Yeah, so now you can see that we have this little box here that's using Tailwind style. So we got the BG red, which is using this arbitrary value support. And then we have our height 20 and width 20, which is being added here. That is part of Tailwind's default spacing styles. So let's change H20 to 400 pixels. And let's do a rebuild. Yeah, so now it's 400 pixels tall. So arbitrary value stuff works. Again, you would use this if it wasn't part of if it wasn't something that you would expect to have to do, but you kind of need to do it for some project requirement. And we can change this one to 600 pixels. You see that it did that there. Now this square is now a rectangle and it's much fatter. Yeah, so what else could we do? We could do, if this box is being hovered, let's change the background to purple. Let's do purple 200. And there's that. Tailwind makes that so easy to handle those situations. But what if we only want it to be hoverable for large screen sizes? Tailwind actually has a bunch of utilities for different breakpoints. So you have SM, MD, LG, XL. I think that's all out of the box. There might be an XS, but I can't remember. So I save this and recompile Tailwind. See that it went ahead and added this media query for me and stuffed this CSS selector inside. So this is going to work here, but if I were to shrink this down to a smaller viewport size, now it doesn't. So it's one of those awesome things that once you deal with Tailwind, it's such a pain to have to hand roll like this stuff. All right, so how can we make this thing even more complex? It's like a little box. Let's think.
I think one thing that I tried to do back in the day was adding like focus rings, but then you have to manually add a variant for hover. For example, like hover wasn't supported on focus ring, so you could change the background color of a focus ring. Maybe that'd be something we could try. Or I was also looking at the docs for the 2.1 release. They actually added some pretty neat stuff for like CSS filters, like blend modes as well.
Yeah, they did.
Also the new isolation property for resetting the stack order for elements. So for example, if you've ever been in Z-index hell where you're trying to like bust out of a overflow hidden element and try to like make a popover show up, you can use that isolation property to reset the stack ordering and then bust out of that container and change the ordering index.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, let me hop on over back to the docs here and see what else they have, what they released lately. How in the world? You know where the blog is from here? Oh, news. There it is. Cool. Yeah, so that's where they announced JIT engine and core. Yeah, this is super cool. The composable CSS filters. So you got to add, let's just do that. So what this should do is add a CSS blur filter to the element. Oh, I don't think I actually copied this correctly. Yeah, we may need to like apply this to an image to really get the full effect. Yeah, look at all this that it makes for us. It's wild. Yeah, that's wild.
So maybe we could try doing this on hover and then adding a like a transition, like a ease or something to it. You could kind of show it's kind of built in, but it's still kind of neat to show like how you can just compose this stuff together. One thing I dropped in the chat shadow was like my first impression of Tailwind was like, ooh, CSS class soup in my markup, and it felt icky. But once I started to kind of think of it as this this way to compose utilities together, it kind of clicked for me, especially in the sense of like if you think of building components, like for example in React or Vue or something, you can build these modular atoms, right, or components with Tailwinds and have all that maybe icky class stuff live there, and then you just compose your application with those top level or those presentational components. So you don't have to worry about the CSS everywhere. You just have it in one place. But then you get the power of Tailwinds to be able to utilize the hover states and the focus and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is one of the biggest gripes with Tailwind is when you see like, oh man, look at all those classes just to achieve like something that I could use Bootstrap with the one CSS selector to get this whole like component experience. It is kind of gross, and I totally admit that in some cases Tailwind isn't the best solution, but in cases, definitely whenever you're building a big production app, and you have the ability to create components, you do have this CSS soup in there, but it's abstracted away from the actual usage of whatever the thing is that you're building. And that once you kind of get used to that workflow, it makes it a whole lot easier. And then definitely once you realize like all of this stuff that Tailwind does for you, it makes the jump kind of worth it to at least tinker and then potentially apply it to a production app. Cool. So I made it to where does Hover not work on these? Oh, I didn't build. Man, I should have really added that. All right. Cool. So now we have hover in front of these. I go back. Yeah, that's kind of disorienting. So I'm sorry to anyone if that hurts your eyes, causes any issues. Cool. So we have hover on filter and filter on hover and the blur on hover. And we also have down here, it's changing the background to purple. So let's look over at Tailwind's docs real quick on how to do the transitions. And we'll add that as well. This is something that, you can get in a pattern of using the same sets of Tailwind utility classes because you can work in a project for a really long time and not need easing or, some of the fancier transition utilities, but their docs are very, very helpful. Yeah, so let's just go to.
Yeah, that's a great point, Shadow. I think one thing to call out is like if you know like the CSS property that you're trying to affect, just using their search bar or like to search for the property, you'll find the group in which like that property is used, right? You'll find the utility, which makes it really handy. If I want to use background color, I can type in background-color and it'll show me the BG utilities as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So you can actually see in this little demo how the transition property works. And that Tailwind's documentation is very, very good. So if you are looking to get into it for the first time, just go through this documentation and they have tons of little examples like this with the actual string of CSS classes needed to achieve whatever they're showing off. Cool. So let's go ahead and let's kind of take this exact transition that we see here and apply it to what we're working on hover. So on hover, let's have our transition. And sorry about the switch from screen to screen. We have duration 50, ease in and out, that's fine. And let's see, you don't really have to specify this stuff on hover. Yeah, we should. Let's just do it. That's it. All right. Cool. So that's built. So let's see what the output is over here. It's actually very disorienting. I'm going to turn the blur off so we can see what's going on. Oh, they're doing all kinds of stuff with this. Actually, grab the properties. Yeah, I don't really use transitions very often with Tailwind, so this is
That's cool.
Somewhat.
So that part, the
Yeah.
part below that, right, the prefers reduced motion, that's actually really neat too. So like if you user preference, like on the browser, say for example, they don't like all the shiny animation or whatever, they want to completely disable or reduce it, you can actually style or change your style according to the user preferences, right? So you can have those helper classes to like disable transitions completely and make it snappy or super fast. Or if they like motion, they can have the the slow fades and the drop shadows and all that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And there's also some in-depth ways to use dark mode with Tailwind. So where you can prefix things with dark colon. So this is another variant type. And depending on the dark mode settings for the user, it will use the utility class that is directly after that variant, which is very, very cool.
Oh, that's really cool. I haven't actually used dark mode yet, so I'm gonna have to give that a try. It'd be kind of cool to have two or three different themes. Do you know if in the config file you could say like, here's my light theme color, here's my dark theme color, and then just have that handle the color switching depending on the mode, or do you have to inline it like this?
I don't really know right off the top of my head. This is the only usage that I've done. I haven't like tried to handle it across the board, but you know, that's let's see if it's in here at all. Yeah, and as you can see here in this section where it says enabling for other utilities, this is what I was talking about the variant config. So like in this case, if you wanted to use some type of text opacity utility in dark mode, that's not enabled by default by Tailwind because the CSS file would just be way too big. But with Tailwind JIT, you don't even have to do this configuration at all. Dark mode is applied to all utilities because it will just infer what you're trying to do based on how you're using it in your template and then generate the CSS according.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And Shadow, thank you so much for talking on this tonight. I'm definitely excited about using the JIT compiler, and I'd love to see some more. I think I actually posted in the chat this link called headlessui.dev.
Yeah.
It's like an accessible registry of some components like modals and dialogues and switches and stuff like that. And so you can use those. There's no styles at all, but you get a set of components where you can actually add tailwinds or whatever else classes inside of them to style these components. And so you get fully, ally compliant components that you can tweak and style however you need to fit your project. But I would love to see kind of more of these type of components start to surface up. Pretty neat.
Yeah, absolutely. And to talk on a little bit about the headless UI stuff, the Tailwind team, Tailwind Labs, they're the ones behind the headless UI library. It's very, very cool stuff that they're pulling off here. Just giving you, in these demonstrations, they're already pre-styled, but as you said, they are completely unstyled, like when you actually use it, except for it does handle accessibility, and you are able to kind of compose this really nice user experience using Tailwind CSS classes. It even looks like they're using the JIT compiler in here. See that?
Yeah, that's cool.
Cool.
I think another one too I dropped in the chat was Tailwind UI. That's actually it's a paid like license-based thing that the Tailwind team also I think they actually also released. But it's a series of components, both HTML, React, and now Vue as well. That it's fully like hero sections, FAQs, testimonials. Like it's got all these like little components that you would normally find on a website, and you could just drop them in. And since there's actually React based components as well, you could just add your copy, right? So if you're a new startup or working on a project and you need to get going quickly, this could be a good resource. Spend $150 or so to get the license for your team, for your project, and off you go. You got your fully baked site with really good compliant CSS or compliant HTML markup, and you could apply your styles to it and change your config file to change the fonts and the images and spacing, or sorry, not images, fonts and colors and spacing, and it makes it your own.
Yeah, absolutely. Tailwind UI. There are some like snippets that you can grab for free. Like if you're still looking at my screen here, I've been kind of browsing through it. Also as a learning resource, seeing what people or what the Tailwind team's actually able to achieve using these utility classes and actually being able to see the output here is very, very helpful. Another awesome learning resource for Tailwind while we're on the train is it's like Tailwind Play, I think. You heard of this? Yeah, Tailwind Play. It's like an entire environment already set up with Tailwind, similar to like what you'd expect from like Code Sandbox, and you can just go nuts with this stuff.
That's slick.
Yeah, it's very, very cool. And you can see the CSS, you can see the config, so you can go in here, play with like adding, green, just add whatever you want, and it compiles in real time. And yeah, it's very awesome if you're looking to learn and then also share things that you built for
totally.
Just to other.
Man, that kind of reminds me. I wish that Russ was here. We did talk a while back on when we were at Lonely Planet how we use Tailwinds and the design tokens system within Tailwinds to inform our design system. And you actually can extract that stuff out and actually put it into Design System Manager, like different design system managers, into Figma, into Sketch, or whatever. And your designers actually can use all those design tokens to build your UIs based on these components. And you ever change your kerning, your leading, your font sizes, spacing, whatever, they just update that JSON file. You can pull that in dynamically when you build your CSS in your project. So the designers have control over all that stuff. They don't have to code really, and they can change it in their editors. And then when next time you recompile, new styles, boom.
You guys need to do a talk on that because I want to see it.
Yeah, it's pretty neat, man. I think we had given a talk on it. I'm not sure if we recorded it, so maybe I can get Russ or somebody over there at Lonely Planet still there to give a talk on it. It's pretty neat. So actually, to share, we're building a new design system UI library. We're not using Tailwinds though, but maybe something similar in terms of the token, using a token system to help inform design could be cool.
Yeah.
Anyways, I keep blabbing. Thank you so much, Shadow. This was great. Thank you all to the viewers at home that have stuck around to watch this. And as we close out, like I said, reminder: if you're interested in giving a talk, let us know. If you have ideas for talks, maybe you don't want to give a talk, but you'd really love to see us cover some topics, also drop us a line. We're always looking for make sure we're servicing you all here that are interested in learning more and making sure that we have new and fresh topics all the time. So hit us up, let us know, and we'll see you next month. Thanks again, Shadow, and thank you, Katie.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.